So we hear it said all the time, if you carry a modified handgun, if you concealed carry a modified handgun, you will end up in jail. Is that true? Let's talk about it. So real quick before we jump into the video, I would like to thank USCCA for supporting the channel. If you're considering CCWing or carrying a handgun or a firearm, I always recommend that you have some sort of legal protection. And USCCA, in my opinion, provides the best legal insurance out there, the best legal protection out there. I'll go ahead and pin a comment down below and also put a link to USCCA in the details. So go ahead and take a look at USCCA if you may be interested. So first and foremost, although I am a licensed and practicing attorney in the state of California, this in no way is legal advice. These are just some general rules and guidelines that you can take in and make, educated decisions for yourself on this. So this is a topic and a question that I get asked all the time, and it is in regards to, can you carry a modified handgun? And if you do so, will a prosecutor use it against you and put you in jail because you carry a modified handgun? So when it comes to modified handguns, there are really two issues. There are cosmetic modifications and then mechanical modifications. So those are the two type of modifications we're gonna talk about. And a lot of times they're talked about independently, but they can be talked about together. And they really are both important, but there are considerations that weigh against one more heavily than the other. So first and foremost, I can't find a single case in the state of California where a modified handgun, whether mechanical or cosmetic, was used as the primary basis behind, the case by the prosecutor. There's not a case in the state of California where I found that the prosecutor said, well, he had a modified handgun, therefore he should end up in jail because of these modified, modifications on the handgun or these cosmetic modifications. He didn't act in self-defense, therefore he goes to jail. It may become a consideration, it may have been consideration in some of the cases, but there is not a single case where that is the sole basis for why an individual ended up in jail. Really what you see in some of these cases, it's more about the self-defense aspect, whether there was a justifiable shooting or not. Now, could a modification, whether cosmetic or mechanical, be used against you? Of course, it could be used against you, and likely maybe will be used against you. The reality is, if a prosecutor or if a DA decides to bring a case against you, they will use anything and everything they can get on you in the case. And if that means you have some sort of modification on your handgun that they could try to use against you, the likelihood is they will try to use it against you. But will, just because you have a modification on your handgun, that you will end up in jail and you will be found criminally liable? No, that is a false statement for people to say just because you have a modification on your handgun, you're going to end up in jail. That is not a true statement. So as I mentioned before, the real question will be whether there was a justifiable shooting or not. Was the shooting justified? Was your act of self-defense justified? That will be the primary consideration in the case, not the modifications to the handgun. So let's say you find yourself in some sort of self-defense situation where you have to use your concealed firearm in self-defense, and let's say someone ends up dead because you use your firearm. The DA will look at the case, the police will look at the case, and they will decide whether they're going to bring, a claim against you or not. Now, if the DA decides not to bring a case, then good, it doesn't become an issue at all. But really the discretion is left up to the DA. And the reality is, if you find yourself in a more liberal or you find yourself in a more anti-Second Amendment, area or county, the likelihood is maybe the prosecutor or the DA will bring a case against you. And like I mentioned, the discretion is left entirely up to the prosecutor. So let's say the prosecutor brings a case against you. Well, your competent defense counsel will just say, well, my client acted in self-defense. And the issue becomes primarily whether you acted in self-defense, was the shooting justifiable or not? And the prosecutor will have to overcome this self-defense claim. So what are the elements of self-defense in the state of California, and how could the modifications to your handgun play into this self-defense issue? That's going to be the primary focus of the case. So when it comes to self-defense, there are three elements that you would have to prove and that the prosecutor would have to overcome or show that were not present. So first you have to prove that you had a reasonable belief that you were in imminent danger of harm or death. So second, you would have to prove that there was a reasonable belief that force was necessary to prevent that harm or death. And third, you have to show that you used only force that was necessary to prevent that harm or injury. So you have to prove that the force or the lethal force you used was proportional to the threat in which was presented to you. So these are the elements to self-defense. So how could modifications to your handgun come into play here? And really the only thing I can think where the prosecutor could use some sort of handgun modification against you to show that you didn't act in self-defense would be some sort of cosmetic modification. So for example, if you had some sort of cosmetic modification or some sort of writing on your handgun that said shoot first, ask questions later, or it's a good day to die, something like that, something that's very brash, something that's very abrasive, and that's very blatant, it is likely that a prosecutor is going to latch onto that and try to use it to refute one of the elements of your self-defense claim. And really one of the elements that this could be used to refute is whether, the force you used was necessary, or maybe even that you use proportional force because, the cosmetic or the writing on your gun shows maybe you were out there looking for a fight. So it's just something to consider. The prosecutor, like I said, will use anything and everything they can against you, but does this, outright mean that, you're going to lose a case if you have some sort of modified handgun or modification on your handgun? No, it doesn't mean that. Now, there are some other areas outside of, criminal liability that handgun modifications could come into play. So the first one, which would be really obvious, is a prosecutor could bring a charge against you if you have some sort of illegal modification on your handgun. So for a quick example, something off the top of my head I could think about is if in some way you modified your handgun to make it automatic, then that would violate some sort of other California law because you cannot have an automatic handgun. You would be violating that California law. And so they would bring that charge against you, but it would not play into your self-defense claim. It wouldn't really play into that specifically. They would just charge you with violating some other California law because you have an illegal modification. Another thing that could come into play is negligence. Let's say you put some sort of modification on your handgun, like you put a really light trigger on it, or you try to put a trigger in your handgun, but you botch it, you're not good at doing it, and you end up negligently discharging your handgun and it injures someone. Then in that scenario, your modification could be used against you in the negligent discharge case, and likely the individual that you accidentally shot will use your modification or you modifying your handgun against you. So those are a couple other scenarios where modifications to the handgun will come into play, where those mechanical modifications may play a larger role than maybe what you thought. But again, those situations may be rare, but they don't go directly to, what we hear a lot said by people in comments and forums is if you just have a modification, you're going to be found criminally liable and you're going to end up in jail. So what would I say to modified handguns, and should you carry a modified handgun or a CCW handgun with modifications to it? Well, first and foremost, don't make any mechanical modifications to it that would outright violate California law. I would never recommend you do that. That's a whole different issue, and if you're making illegal mechanical modifications to your handgun, you're probably not even worried about the rest of this stuff. Another thing I would recommend is be very careful while messing with the internals of your handgun. And if you're gonna do something like that, have a licensed, gunsmith do it on that, because that provides you that extra layer of protection, because what you could say is, I sent this gun out to be worked by a professional. This professional is the one who botched it, not me. Another thing I would recommend is don't put any sort of controversial statements or anything like that on your carry firearm. Now on your non-carry firearms, if you're not going to be, carrying a specific handgun, if you have a Glock that you don't carry all the time, go ahead and put whatever you want on those. It's up to you, it's your discretion. But what I would recommend is for the handguns that you carry on your person for CCW, make sure that you don't have any of those cosmetic modifications on that could be potentially used against you. It's just better practice to not have anything on that. Really, other than that, it's up to you. You guys are adults, you're law-abiding residents and citizens. You can make, educated decisions for yourself. These are just some general guidelines that I would recommend to you guys. So hopefully you found this information helpful. If you have any questions, go ahead and write a comment down below and I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. If you found this video helpful and you'd like to support the channel, the best way to do that is to join the Patreon, and I'll put a link to the Patreon page down in the details. So as always, thanks you guys for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And never forget, a nation that draws a great distinction between its scholars and its warriors, while its laws are by cowards and its wars fought by fools.